300 years and heroes become legends. Legends become myth. Myth fades from memory.
Though it's now considered to be a more serious branch of the strategy genre. Wargaming first arose as in-depth training exercises meant to develop the decision-making skills of real-life military personnel. Civilians eventually caught wind of the thrills of conquering these incredibly difficult challenges, and it's no wonder that video games would end up adopting many of these mechanics in classics like Strategic Simulation's Panzer General series. Now that franchise wouldn't be the studio's only foray into wargaming, however, as the developers would eventually translate these realistic and oftentimes brutal simulations into a fantasy environment through another beloved title, Fantasy General. Now, over 2 decades later, Owned by Gravity is attempting to revamp the series for a whole new generation with a long-awaited sequel in Fantasy General 2. Set 300 years after the original, the new game returns players to the war-torn land of Keldonia, where they'll start by stepping into the shoes of the up-and-coming son of a barbarian chief. Invading tribes and imperial conspiracies will have to be dealt with as players battle through numerous open-ended missions in an attempt at preserving Falir One-Eye's clan. The initial gameplay might seem like a curious hybrid of turn-based strategy and a classic RPG, with your character commanding a small collection of units through familiar fantasy landscapes, completing quests, and acquiring loot. But it won't take long for you to amass a considerable amount of followers and engage in massive battles. Now, these units actually have unique abilities and level up alongside the player, which adds even more tension to every single skirmish. Even minor casualties can have a huge impact later on in the game, which can be a bit frustrating when you're forced to reload older saves due to randomized tragedies and the occasional strategic blunder. Now, you do have the option of summoning reinforcements, always for a hefty price, and only if you're near a friendly stronghold, but these units don't carry over any previous experience and equipment, which can be a huge problem down the line. In general, the game is remarkably good at introducing players to the harsh world where tactical thinking is an essential survival skill. Learning about proper ambushes, flanking enemies, and even the virtues of a well-executed retreat is pretty much required in order to guarantee any amount of progress. While mastering these mechanics and overcoming the odds is immensely satisfying, the difficulty escalates quickly. And in just a few levels, many players will find Fantasy General 2 to be a pretty unforgiving experience. Now, that being said, the game actively encourages experimentation with its open-ended level design and nearly endless tactical possibilities. Missions will rarely play out the same way twice, and story decisions can sway the tide of battle in your favor. As long as you don't mind a little bit of trial and error, there's actually a lot of fun to be had in simply playing around with the game's mechanics. The sandbox-styled levels boast multiple paths and varying wind conditions, which can also help to make things less repetitive during repeated playthroughs. Things get progressively more interesting as you traverse through the campaign, with the player gaining access to larger collection of units and minor battles turning into an all-out war. These moments are incredibly exciting, but it's a shame that the narrative itself can't quite keep up with the grandiose gameplay. That's not to say that Fantasy General 2 has a bad story, as I thoroughly enjoyed the lore and expansive setting, but the characters aren't all that interesting, and it's quite clear that the plot here is just an excuse to take the players from one combat-related predicament to the next. The presentation doesn't help much either, as the simplistic dialogue boxes filled with hefty amounts of text can get sort of tedious after a while. Nonetheless, I did appreciate how your story decisions matter and can change how the levels pan out. I'll also admit that things pick up steam later on as the plot thickens and more characters are introduced into the mix. Overall, Fantasy General 2 may not be for everyone with its glaring difficulty spikes and conventional story, but wargaming veterans are guaranteed to have a blast playing around with the game's systems, especially once they get the hang of the highly customizable skirmish mode and online functionality. There's a lot of bang for your buck here, so I definitely recommend this one, but novices should approach the brutal world of Keldonia with caution.